All right, guys. So for our first lesson on Unit 2, we're going to be drawing this pine tree. Okay. So the reason I chose this pine tree is actually because it's very forgiving when it comes to the mistakes that you make. All right. The reason for that is because the shapes in this are very abstract and they don't have to be perfect. All right. You want to get as close as you can, but if you do that, make that mistake, it's still probably going to look like a tree. Okay, as long as you're following the steps that I taught you previously. All right. Today in particular, we're going to be focusing on the first step of drawing from a reference, and that's finding the simple shapes as well as the proportions of our reference. All right. So if we're looking at our reference here, there really is only one major shape, and that's this shape of the tree itself. And then within that shape, you're gonna have these smaller like leaf pads, right? These areas where these lines where the leaves sit. And we also have this major structure in the front of our image that's kind of blocking our view, our complete view of the tree. Okay, so we're going to be talking about how we're going to deal with that, or how I'm going to deal with that as well. Okay, so taking my paper, I know that the major shape of the um, the image of the reference is this triangular shape. Okay, remember, right now at this step, I'm not looking at it as a tree. I'm looking at it as simple shapes. Okay, so I'm going to start with a large triangle as my first shape. Okay, and I'm going to close that triangle off. And if I look at the bush that's sitting in front of the tree, okay, I have to decide, am I going to make up what I can't see, as in I'm going to pretend like I can see it and then try to draw that? Or am I going to just draw what's blocking the tree uh, in my drawing here? Okay, so in my opinion, um, if you don't really fully understand how this tree works, as in like if you haven't seen a bunch of these in real life, you don't understand how they normally behave, then it's going to be really hard for you to imagine what's behind this bush here. Okay, so I would go with the second option, which is actually just to draw this bush. All right, so this bush here, it kind of gets cut off, and that's okay. But it's kind of this weird, smaller triangle at the bottom. Now, I'm not going to draw the border as a line. I'm just going to draw this diagonal line that cuts through my triangle. Okay, so about here, I see that it's a little bit past. Oh, here we go. So you can see my paper. So if I look at the reference, right, this line, there's a bit of space between the edge of the bush and where my tree starts. Okay, so I'm gonna look to give it about this much of a length, maybe a little closer. And like I said, it's a diagonal line. It's not too steep where it's like a mountain, but it is covering about a corner of my tree there. Okay, and I can think about where that line ends in the image here. I drew a little line there to say, okay, that's where the picture would end. But in reality, I think it's about here. And I'm also going to erase what I don't need anymore, right? As I mentioned, this triangle is being blocked off by this diagonal shape right here. All right. And there you go. Okay. I know it looks really simple right now, but if this is too simple, right? If you think, okay, this isn't enough, right? This is too easy, this isn't enough, then go even further, right? You can actually break up this tree into these smaller shapes here. I know this is kind of stepping into the refined shapes, right? But as long as we stick to simple shapes and not these like very complex shapes with curves and corners and things like that, then we're still sticking to step one. Okay, so I'm gonna actually break this triangle up into smaller shapes. Okay, so the first one is going to be this here. I see this huge gap where this triangle is, or sorry, at the bottom of this triangle. Okay, and that's about, I want to say, a third, maybe even less than that, maybe like a quarter of the way down my triangle. So about there on my drawing, I'm just going to leave that triangle there. Okay, and then below that, I have a smaller one here, but it's still kind of connected. So I'm actually no, let's think of it this way. You have this bigger middle section because I see this gap here, right? It's easy for me to see that gap. So I'm gonna break that up into another section, okay? So there's a small gap. I'm gonna make sure I leave a little bit of space here. And then we have a larger triangle, like so. And remember, the reason that we break it up into these simple shapes is so that when we are working on all of the details, right, we number one, have the proportions correct, and number two, we can work in these small areas. All right, we can think about, okay, what are the details here, and then once I'm done here, move on to the details here. Okay, back to this. All right, so then I noticed down here too, this triangle gets kind of cut off at the bottom, right? So if I'm looking at my triangle here, it actually gets cut off there, right? And like I said before, there's a small gap right here. So I'm gonna add that small gap here as well. Okay, so it's not really a triangle anymore exactly, but we use that larger triangle and then cut it up like a pie into these shapes. Okay, and then I'm gonna erase any of the excess that I do not need anymore, like so. All right. And now this thing in the front is just kind of this big mass. I don't really see very many ways we can break it apart. Let's see, there's this one part right here. So that's something we can do. And I noticed that it kind of lines up with this line here. And that's going to help me with my picture here, in my drawing here. So I have this mass and it kind of just breaks apart right there, right? But there's really a very small gap, if anything. So I'm just going to continue it like this. All right, and then erase any excess. Okay, so that's pretty much it for step one, right? Check your proportions again. So I'm looking at mine at the top. Good to go for that piece. This piece is taking up a large portion, and then this piece is also taking up a large portion. All right, and this front bush is still blocking the tree. So that's it. Good to go, right? Trees are very simple. Trees have only so many shapes to them, or simple shapes to them. The hardest part is when you get into the details, okay?